The grandfather clock in the Ashford Manor struck midnight as Margaret Ashford pressed her ear against the cold mahogany door of the study. The house had been silent for hours, yet something had drawn her from her bed. Something that whispered her name through the walls themselves. The door handle turned beneath her trembling fingers, though she was certain she hadn't moved her hand. The study beyond lay shrouded in darkness, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where her great-grandfather's blood had once pooled nearly a century ago. But it was the sound that made her blood run cold, the soft scratching of a fountain pen against parchment. Someone was writing in the darkness. Someone who shouldn't be there. Margaret's breath caught at her throat as she stepped into the room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The scratching continued, methodical and precise, coming from the direction of the antique writing desk where generations of Ashfords had penned their final letters, their confessions, their desperate pleas for forgiveness. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out the silhouette of a figure hunched over the desk, writing with deliberate strokes. The figure's shoulders were narrow, familiar, and Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as recognition dawned. It was her brother Thomas. Thomas, who had been dead for 3 days. The scratching stopped. The figure slowly raised its head, and in the pale moonlight, Margaret saw a face that was both her brother's, and something far more terrible. The eyes that met hers were black as coal, and when the thing that wore Thomas's face smiled, she saw that its teeth were stained with what looked like old blood. "Hello, sister," it whispered, its voice like autumn leaves scraping against stone. "I've been waiting for you to join the family tradition." But how had it come to this? How had the Ashford family, once among the most respected names in Victorian England, become synonymous with madness, murder, and supernatural terror? To understand the horror that Margaret faced that night, we must go back to where it all began, in the year 1847, when Cornelius Ashford first laid eyes on the cursed manor that would become his family's tomb. The Ashford family history reads like a Gothic novel penned by a madman, each chapter more disturbing than the last. It begins innocently enough in the spring of 1847, when Cornelius Ashford, a wealthy textile merchant from Manchester, purchased what locals called the Whitmore Estate, a sprawling manor house nestled in the fog-shrouded moors of Yorkshire. Estate had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades, ever since the mysterious disappearance of the Whitmore family. Lord Edmund Whitmore, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children had vanished without a trace on a cold October night in 1829. The only clue to their fate was a series of strange symbols carved into the cellar walls, symbols that local clergy refused to discuss and scholars claimed resembled no known language. Cornelius, however, was a practical man who scoffed at superstition. The manor was magnificent, 37 rooms spread across 3 floors, with soaring ceilings, ornate crown molding, and windows that caught the light like jewels. The price was remarkably low, even accounting for the property's grim reputation, and Cornelius saw it as the perfect opportunity to establish his family's place among England's landed gentry. The first sign that something was amiss came during the renovation. Workers reported tools moving on their own, strange drafts in sealed rooms, and the persistent sound of children laughing in the empty nursery. 3 different contractors abandoned the project, claiming they felt watched while working alone in certain parts of the house. But it was the discovery in the walls that should have sent Cornelius and his family fleeing back to Manchester. While expanding the library, workers broke through what they assumed was a false wall, only to find a hidden chamber containing 13 wooden boxes, each no larger than a child's coffin. Inside the boxes were not bodies, but collections of personal effects, locks of hair, children's toys, faded photographs, and handwritten letters that spoke of the family curse and the price of dwelling in cursed ground. The letters were signed by members of families who had lived in the manor over the past century. The Whitmores, the Hargraves before them, and the Blackwoods before that. Each letter told the same story: children disappearing, adults driven to madness, and the gradual corruption of bloodlines that had once been proud and noble. The most disturbing letter was written by Catherine Whitmore herself, dated just 3 days before her family's disappearance. Asterisk, the house has claimed Edmund. I found him in the cellar at dawn, carving symbols into the stone with his fingernails until they bled. He speaks of voices that call to him from beneath the foundation, voices that promise him power over life and death if he will only make the necessary sacrifice. I fear what that sacrifice might be. I fear what I might become if I remain here, but I cannot leave. Something holds us here, something that grows stronger with each passing day. If you find this letter, burn the house, salt the earth. Let no other families suffer as we have suffered. Asterisk, Cornelius burned the letters, but not the house. He was a man of the industrial age, and he refused to be deterred by the delusions of previous residents. The hidden chamber was sealed, the renovations completed, and in the autumn of 1847, Cornelius moved his family into what would become known as Ashford Manor. His wife, Evangeline, was a delicate woman of gentle breeding who had given him 3 children: Edmund, named ironically after the previous owner; Constance, a precocious girl of 12; and little William, barely 5 years old. They settled into their new home with high hopes and grand plans for the future. The first winter was unusually harsh. Snow fell early and deep, effectively isolating the manor from the outside world for months at a time. It was during this isolation that the family began to change. Cornelius grew increasingly obsessed with the history of the house, spending hours in the library researching the previous owners. He filled journal after journal with his findings, documenting every tragic death, every mysterious disappearance, every whispered tale of supernatural activity. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the months passed, and his entries became less about historical research and more about something else. Asterisk, the voices are clearer now. He wrote in February of 1848. They speak of the old ways, of contracts written in blood and sealed with sacrifice. They tell me that the Ashford name can be made immortal, that our family can transcend death itself if we are willing to pay the price. But what price? What sacrifice do they demand? Asterisk, meanwhile, the children began exhibiting strange behaviors. Edmund, 17 and normally robust, grew pale and gaunt, claiming that he could hear his ancestors calling to him from the cellar. Constance started sleepwalking, often found standing in the garden at dawn, staring up at the third-floor windows with vacant eyes. And little William. William began speaking to invisible companions, carrying on full conversations with what he called the shadow children. But it was Evangeline who suffered the most dramatic transformation, the gentle woman who had entered. The manor began experiencing violent episodes, destroying furniture and artwork while screaming about the watchers in the walls. She claimed that the house was alive, that it fed on the emotional energy of its inhabitants, growing stronger with each passing day. The first death occurred in the spring of 1848, exactly 1 year after the family's arrival. The death of little William Ashford was found at the bottom of the grand staircase on a Tuesday morning in April, his small body twisted at impossible angles, his neck clearly broken. The circumstances of his death defied explanation. The boy had been a cautious child, afraid of heights, and there were no witnesses to suggest how he might have fallen. But it was the state of his room that truly disturbed the household staff. Every toy had been arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, and in the center of this circle, written in what appeared to be blood, were the same strange symbols that had been carved into the cellar walls decades earlier. The local constable, a man named Inspector Bradshaw, conducted a thorough investigation. He found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, and no reasonable explanation for how a 5-year-old boy could have inscribed such precise symbols while bleeding from a fatal head wound. The boy must have fallen, Bradshaw concluded, though his report noted several inconsistencies that troubled him. However, the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the body suggest irregularities that warrant further investigation. That further investigation never came. Inspector Bradshaw was found dead in his study 3 days later, apparently having taken his own life with a service revolver. His suicide note was brief and cryptic. Asterisk, some secrets are too dangerous to uncover. The Ashford boy's death was no accident, but neither was it murder. There are forces at work in that house that no man of law can comprehend or constrain. I pray that God forgives me for my cowardice. Asterisk, the death of little William marked the beginning of what locals would later call the Ashford curse. But for the family itself, it was merely the first note in a symphony of horror that would play out over the next century and a half. The madness of Evangeline. Following her youngest son's death, Evangeline Ashford's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She became convinced that William was still alive, somewhere in the house, and she could often be heard calling his name in the empty corridors, pleading. With him to come home for dinner, the household staff reported increasingly disturbing incidents. Evangeline would be found in William's room, setting out clothes for him, preparing his bed, and singing lullabies to empty air. She claimed that she could see him, that he visited her every night to tell her about his adventures with the shadow. Children, but it was her conversations with the walls that truly alarmed the family. Evangeline would stand facing the wainscoting in the library or the dining room, carrying on detailed discussions with what she claimed were previous residents of the house. She spoke of Catherine Whitmore as if the woman were standing right beside her, and she often repeated warnings about the hunger of the foundation and the price of blood. Cornelius, consumed by his own obsessions, barely noticed his wife's decline. He had become fixated on the idea that the house was some kind of supernatural repository, a place where the boundary between life and death was thin enough to cross. His journals from this period reveal a man descending into madness, convinced that he could communicate with the dead and harness their power for his own purposes. Asterisk, Evangeline speaks more truth than she knows. He wrote in June of 1848, "House is indeed alive, but not in the way she imagines. It is a conductor, a lens through which the energy of death can be focused and channeled. The previous owners were weak, unprepared for the responsibility that comes with such power, but I am different. I understand what must be done." Asterisk, the breaking point came in August of 1848 during a particularly violent thunderstorm. The staff was awakened by screaming from the master bedroom, and they found Evangeline standing over Cornelius's unconscious form, a bloody letter opener clutched in her hand. He was going to give Edmund to them, she shrieked as the servants restrained her. He was going to feed our son to the hunger beneath the house, just like the others did with their children. But I stopped him. Cornelius survived the attack, though he bore the scars for the rest of his life. 3. Parallel gashes ran from his left temple to his jaw, and he never fully recovered the use of his left eye. But more disturbing than his physical injuries was his reaction to the attack. "She was right to stop me," he told the constable who investigated the incident. "The voices had become too insistent, too demanding. I was not yet ready to make the sacrifice they required." Evangeline was committed to Bedlam Asylum, where she died 6 months later under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as brain fever, but the attending physician's private notes, discovered years later, told a different story. Asterisk double quotes, Mrs. Ashford's condition was unlike anything I have encountered in 20 years of practice. She claimed to be in constant communication with deceased family members, and her descriptions of their appearances and circumstances were remarkably detailed and consistent. More troubling still, she demonstrated knowledge of events that had occurred before her birth, speaking of the Whitmore family's final days with an accuracy that suggests, I hardly know what to suggest. On the night of her death, she was heard speaking to someone in her cell, though the guards insisted she was alone. Her final words, according to the night attendant, were, I understand now. The price was never meant to be paid by us. We were always meant to become the price. Asterisk, the transformation of Edmund, with his mother dead and his father consumed by occult obsessions. 18-year-old Edmund Ashford was left to manage the estate and care for his sister Constance. By all accounts, he was a responsible young man who tried to restore some normalcy to their lives, but the house had already begun to work its influence on him. Edmund's transformation was more subtle than his parents', but no less disturbing. He began experiencing what he called walking dreams, episodes where he would find himself in parts of the house, with no memory of how he had gotten there. These episodes always occurred at night, and they always led him to the cellar, where he would stand before the wall of carved symbols, feeling an overwhelming urge to add his own markings to the ancient script. His diary entries from this period reveal a young man struggling against forces he couldn't understand or control. Asterisk, I woke this morning to find my fingernails torn and bloody, though I have no memory of injuring them. There is stone dust beneath them, and I fear I know where it came from. The cellar calls to me nightly now, and each time I resist, the compulsion grows stronger. I have begun tying myself to my bed, but somehow I still find myself standing before those accursed symbols, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon me. Asterisk, as the weeks passed, Edmund's sleepwalking episodes became more frequent and more violent. He was found one morning in the library, having apparently spent the night transcribing the cellar symbols into every book on the shelves. The symbols were drawn in what appeared to be blood, though Edmund bore no visible wounds. Another night, he was discovered in the garden, digging frantically at the base of an old oak tree. When questioned, he claimed that they had told him to prepare a place for the new offerings, though he couldn't explain who they were or what offerings they required. But it was his relationship with his sister, Constance, that provided the most disturbing evidence of his deterioration. The two siblings had always been close, but Edmund began to regard her with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He would follow her through the house, watching her with an expression that the staff described as hungry, and he began speaking of her as if she were some kind of precious object that needed to be protected at all costs. Asterisk, Constance is the key. He wrote in September of 1848, the voices have made it clear that she is different, special. Her bloodline carries something that they need, something that has been passed down through generations of women in our family. Mother had it too, but she was weak, unprepared. Constance is stronger. She can bear the weight of what is to come. Asterisk, the truth about Constance's special nature would soon become horrifyingly clear. The disappearance of Constance Ashford was 13 years old when she vanished from her locked bedroom on the night of October 31st, St. 1848. The circumstances of her disappearance were impossible to explain through conventional means. Her room was on the 3rd floor. The windows were sealed shut against the autumn cold, and the door was locked from the inside. When the staff broke down the door the following morning, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Every mirror in the room had been shattered, the glass arranged in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The walls were covered with symbols, not carved, but burned into the wood as if by some intense heat dot, and in the center of the room, written in what appeared to be blood, was a message in Constance's handwriting, Asterisk, the family debt is called due. The blood of the daughters must flow to feed the hunger of the foundation. I go willingly to take my place among the watchers in the walls. Do not mourn for me. I am not gone. I am home. Asterisk, a search of the house and grounds revealed no trace of the girl. The cellar, however, bore new additions to its collection of symbols, and the staff reported that the stone walls seemed to radiate a subtle warmth, as if something beneath them was burning with slow, steady flame. Edmund's reaction to his sister's disappearance was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire incident. Rather than grief or concern, he displayed what could only be described as satisfaction, as if some long-awaited event had finally come to pass. She has fulfilled her purpose, he told the constable who investigated the disappearance. The family line is secure now. The contract is sealed. When pressed for details about this contract, Edmund became evasive, speaking in riddles about the old agreements and the price of power. He claimed that Constance had not been taken against her will, but had gone willingly to fulfill a destiny that had been written in blood generations ago. Asterisk, you do not understand. Asterisk, he wrote in his diary following the investigation. Asterisk, what appears to be loss is actually transformation. Constance has not died. She has become something greater, something eternal. She watches over us now from within the walls themselves, and her sacrifice has ensured that the Ashford name will never truly die. The voices are quiet now, satisfied. The hunger is fed. For now. Asterisk, the authorities were baffled by the case, but, without evidence of foul play, they could do nothing but classify Constance's disappearance as unexplained. The investigation was quietly closed, and the file was buried in the depths of the county records office, where it would remain undisturbed for decades. The decline of Cornelius, with his wife dead, his youngest son deceased, and his daughter vanished. Cornelius Ashford retreated entirely into madness. He sealed himself in the library, emerging only for meals and brief walks through the house, during which he would speak to empty air, as if carrying on conversations with invisible companions. The household staff reported increasingly bizarre incidents. Cornelius would be found standing in the hallway at all hours, apparently listening to voices that only he could hear. He would nod thoughtfully, ask questions, and respond to answers that no one else could perceive. His appearance deteriorated rapidly. The once dignified merchant became gaunt and wild-eyed, his hair growing long and unkempt, his clothes hanging loose on his shrinking frame. He stopped bathing, stopped changing his clothes, and seemed to exist on nothing but the occasional crust of bread and sips of water. But it was his writings that provided the most disturbing insight into his mental state. He filled journal after journal with detailed accounts of his conversations with the dead, transcribing what he claimed were messages from previous owners of the house, from his deceased family members, and from entities that he described as the original inhabitants of the land. Asterisk, Catherine Whitmore visited me again last night. He wrote in November of 1848. She brought the others with her, generations of women who have fed the hunger of the foundation. Evangeline was among them, and she looked so beautiful, so peaceful. She told me that the transformation is nearly complete, that soon I will join them in the eternal service of the house. I long for that day. This flesh is a prison, and I am tired of carrying its weight. Asterisk, his final journal entry, dated December 21st, 1848, was barely legible. Asterisk, the time has come. The winter solstice marks the completion of the cycle. Edmund will carry on the bloodline, but my role is finished. The foundation calls to me, and I must answer. The voices promise that death is not the end, but the beginning of true service. I go willingly to join my family in the walls. May God forgive what we have become. Asterisk, Cornelius Ashford was found dead in the cellar on the morning of December 22nd, 1848. his body positioned directly beneath the wall of symbols. The cause of death was unclear. There were no wounds, no signs of violence, and no obvious medical explanation for his demise, but it was the condition of his body that truly disturbed those who discovered him. Cornelius appeared to have been drained of blood, his skin paper-white and translucent, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. More disturbing still, his body seemed to be merging with the stone floor, as if the very rock was consuming his flesh. The local physician who examined the body could offer no explanation for the phenomenon. "I have never seen anything like it," he wrote in his report. The deceased appears to have been. Absorbed is the only word I can think of. The stone beneath him is warm to the touch, and I swear I can feel a pulse within it, as if something is alive down there. Edmund refused to allow an autopsy, claiming that his father's wishes had been clear. The body was to be left undisturbed, to complete its natural transformation. Against the advice of the authorities, Cornelius Ashford was entombed in the cellar where he died, his body sealed behind a wall of brick and mortar, but the sealing of the tomb would not end the horror. If anything, it would only make it worse. The reign of Edmund, with his family dead or disappeared, Edmund Ashford became the sole master of the manor at the age of 19. The traumatic events of the previous year had changed him fundamentally, transforming him from a responsible young man into something far more sinister. Edmund's first act as the new lord of the manor was to dismiss all of the household staff, claiming that he preferred solitude. In reality, he had begun to hear voices, not the whispered communications that had plagued his father, but clear, distinct commands that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The voices belonged to his family, or entities that claimed to be his family. They spoke of the great work that needed to be done, of the bloodline that needed to be continued, and of the sacrifices that would be required to maintain the family's newfound power over death. They are not gone. Edmund wrote in his diary, in January of 1849, death is merely transformation, and those who die within these walls are not lost, but preserved. They live on in the stone, in the wood, in the very air of the house. They watch over the family, guide our actions, and ensure that the Ashford name will endure for eternity. But the voices made it clear that Edmund's solitude could not last forever. The bloodline needed to continue, and that meant finding a wife who could bear the next generation of Ashfords. More importantly, it meant finding a woman who could eventually join the eternal guardians that dwelt within the walls. Edmund began courting Sarah Blackwood, the daughter of a local merchant who was unaware of the Ashford family's dark reputation. Sarah was 18, beautiful, and possessed of a gentle nature that reminded Edmund of his mother. She was also, according to the voices, suitable for the transformation. The courtship was brief and intense. Edmund showered Sarah with gifts and attention, and despite the warnings of her family about the strange happenings at Ashford Manor, she was charmed by his passionate declarations of love. They were married in the spring of 1849, in a small ceremony held in the manor's library. No guests were invited, no family members attended, and the only witness was the vicar who performed the ceremony, a man who later claimed that he had felt watched throughout the entire proceedings, as if invisible eyes were observing every word and gesture. Sarah's transformation began almost immediately after the wedding. Like the Ashford women before her, she began experiencing strange dreams, hearing whispers in empty rooms, and seeing shadows that moved independently of any light source. But unlike Evangeline, Sarah seemed to embrace these supernatural experiences, rather than resist them. "She is perfect," Edmund wrote in his diary following their honeymoon. The voices sing her praises, and she responds to their guidance with joy rather than fear. She understands her role in the great work, and she is eager to fulfill it. Soon she will bear the next generation, and then she will take her place among the eternal guardians. Asterisk, but the voices had plans for Sarah that went beyond simple motherhood. They spoke of a ritual that would need to be performed, a ceremony that would bind her soul to the house and ensure that her children would be born with the proper connections to the spirit world. The ritual took place on the night of the winter solstice, exactly 1 year after Cornelius's death. Sarah was led to the cellar, where she knelt before the wall of symbols and allowed Edmund to carve matching marks into her flesh. The cutting was precise, deliberate, and apparently painless. Sarah remained conscious throughout the entire procedure, speaking in a language that neither she nor Edmund had ever heard before. When the ritual was complete, Sarah's wounds had healed without scarring, and her eyes had taken on a strange, luminous quality that seemed to glow in the darkness. She was no longer entirely human, but something more, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Asterisk, the transformation is complete. Asterisk, Edmund wrote that night. Asterisk, Sarah is now one of us, bound to the house and the family by bonds that transcend death itself. She carries within her the power to birth children who will be born already connected to the eternal guardians. The bloodline is secure. Asterisk, 9 months later, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, who were born with the same luminous eyes as their mother. The children were named Cornelius and Constance, after their deceased grandfather and aunt, and from the moment of their birth, they displayed abilities that no mortal children should possess. But the birth of the twins would mark the beginning of a new and even more terrifying chapter in the Ashford family's dark history. The unnatural children the twins born to Edmund and Sarah Ashford were not normal children by any measure. From their earliest days, they displayed an awareness and intelligence that was far beyond their years, and they seemed to possess an innate understanding of the supernatural forces that governed their family's existence. Young Cornelius could speak in full sentences by his first birthday, and the things he said chilled the hearts of even his devoted parents. He would describe events that had occurred before his birth with perfect accuracy, speaking of his grandfather's death and his aunt's disappearance as if he had witnessed them personally. "Grandfather is in the walls," he told his parents on his second birthday, pointing to the stone foundation of the house. "He watches us and waits for us to join him. He says the wait is almost over." Constance, meanwhile, seemed to be in constant communication with invisible companions. She would spend hours playing elaborate games with entities that only she could see, laughing and chattering in a mixture of English and the same unknown language that her mother had spoken during her transformation ritual. The most disturbing aspect of the children's behavior was their apparent ability to predict death. They would often speak of neighbors and townsfolk going to sleep soon or joining the watchers, and within days these individuals would indeed die under mysterious circumstances. Asterisk, the children are becoming what we always hoped they would be. Asterisk, Edmund wrote in his diary when the twins were 3 years old. Asterisk, they are perfect conduits between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Through them, the family's power will grow beyond anything we have ever imagined. Asterisk, but the voices had new instructions for Edmund, instructions that would require him to make the ultimate sacrifice for the family's continued power. Sarah's role in the great work was nearly complete. She had borne the children who would carry on the bloodline, and now she was ready to join the eternal guardians who watched over the family from within the walls. The ritual would need to be performed on the anniversary of her transformation, and Edmund would need to be the one to guide her through the final transition. The thought of losing Sarah terrified Edmund, but the voices were insistent. The family's power depended on the willing sacrifice of each generation's mother, and Sarah had always known that this day would come. "She is ready," the voices whispered to him night after night. Asterisk, She longs to join us, to become one with the eternal guardians. Do not let your mortal attachments prevent you from fulfilling your duty to the family. Asterisk on the night of the winter solstice, 1852, Edmund led Sarah to the cellar for the final ritual. The children, now 3 years old, accompanied them, showing no fear or sadness at what was about to occur. The ceremony was brief but intense. Sarah knelt before the wall of symbols, speaking in the unknown language as Edmund carved the final marks into her flesh. But this time, the cuts did not heal. Instead, they began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, and Sarah's body became translucent, as if she were fading from the physical world. "I can see them," she whispered as the transformation neared completion. "I can see all of them, your father, your mother, your sister. They are so beautiful, so peaceful. They are waiting for me." With those words, Sarah Ashford disappeared, her body dissolving into points of light that seemed to absorb into the stone walls themselves. The cellar grew warm, and the symbols on the walls pulsed with a gentle radiance that would persist for decades to come. Edmund was now alone with the children, but he knew that Sarah was still with them, watching over them from within the house itself. The voices confirmed this, speaking of her presence in every room, her influence guiding every decision. But the children were growing older, and soon they would need to fulfill their own roles in the family's dark legacy. A next generation as young Cornelius and Constance grew into adolescence. Their supernatural abilities became more pronounced and more disturbing. They could speak with the dead as easily as with the living, and they seemed to regard death not as an ending, but as a transformation to be anticipated and welcomed. Cornelius, now 17, had begun keeping his own journal, documenting the family's history and his growing understanding of the forces that governed their existence. Asterisk, the house is not merely our home, it is our destiny. Every generation has added to its power, feeding it with blood and sacrifice until it has become something more than a simple dwelling. It is a repository of souls, a fortress where the dead can continue their existence free from the constraints of mortality. We are not its prisoners, but its guardians, and one day we will join those who have gone before us in eternal service. Asterisk Constance, meanwhile, had developed an obsession with the rituals that had transformed her ancestors. She spent hours in the cellar, studying the symbols and speaking with the spirits that dwelt within the walls. She claimed that she could see them clearly now. Her grandmother Evangeline, her aunt Constance, her mother Sarah, and dozens of others who had lived and died within the house over the centuries. Asterisk, they are all here. Asterisk, she told her father one evening as they dined alone in the vast dining room. Asterisk, every woman who has ever borne the Ashford name, every child who has ever been born within these walls. They watch over us, guide us, and prepare us for the moment when we too will join them in the eternal service of the house. Asterisk Edmund recognized that the time was approaching when he would need to make arrangements for the continuation of the bloodline. The voices had made it clear that both children would need to marry and produce offspring before they could take their places among the eternal guardians. But finding suitable partners for children who could speak with the dead and predict the future was no simple task. The potential spouses would need to be strong enough to survive the transformation rituals, yet innocent enough to be drawn into the family's web of supernatural power. Edmund decided to follow the pattern established by his ancestors. He would seek out partners from families that were unaware of the Ashford reputation, young people who could be charmed and seduced before they understood the true nature of what they were joining. For Cornelius, he chose Margaret Whitmore, a distant relative of the family that had originally owned the manor. Margaret was 19, beautiful, and possessed of a rebellious spirit that reminded Edmund of his sister Constance. More importantly, She carried the same bloodline that had proven so conducive to supernatural transformation. For Constance, he selected Jonathan Blackwood, a young man from the same family that had given him his beloved Sarah. Jonathan was intelligent, passionate, and deeply interested in the occult, qualities that would serve him well in his new role as an Ashford family member. The courtships were successful, and both weddings were held in the Manor's library within a month of each other. The ceremonies were small, intimate affairs, with only the immediate family members present, though the bride and groom were unaware that immediate family included dozens of deceased relatives who observed the proceedings from within the walls themselves. The transformation of the new spouses began immediately. Margaret and Jonathan both experienced the dreams, the whispers, and the visions that had affected every Ashford family member. But unlike some of their predecessors, both young people embraced their supernatural experiences with enthusiasm rather than fear. Asterisk, they are perfect. Asterisk, Edmund wrote in his diary following the weddings. Asterisk, Margaret possesses the same spiritual sensitivity as the Whitmore women who came before her, and Jonathan has the strength and intelligence to serve as a worthy guardian of the family's secrets. The bloodline is secure, and the next generation will be even more powerful than the last. Asterisk, within a year, both couples had produced children. Margaret bore twins, a boy and a girl, while Constance gave birth to a son who was born with the same luminous eyes as his mother. The children were named according to family tradition, carrying the names of their deceased ancestors and the weight of their supernatural inheritance. But the birth of the new generation also marked the beginning of the end for Edmund's time as the mortal guardian of the family legacy. The final transformation. By 1870, Edmund Ashford had served as the head of the family for more than 20 years. He had overseen the transformation of 2 generations, guided the supernatural education of his children, and maintained the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But the voices had made it clear that his time as a mortal guardian was drawing to a close. The family's power had grown beyond anything that previous generations had imagined, and the house itself had become a nexus of supernatural energy that required more direct oversight than any living person could provide. Edmund's final journal. Entries reveal a man who was ready to embrace his transformation. Asterisk, I have done what was asked of me. The bloodline is secure, the children are prepared, and the house has grown strong beyond measure. I am tired of the weight of mortal flesh, tired of the limitations of physical existence. The voices promise that death is not an ending, but a graduation, a promotion to a higher level of service. I am ready to join my family in the walls, to become one with the eternal guardians who watch over the Ashford name. Asterisk, the ritual that would transform Edmund took place on the night of his 50th birthday, witnessed by his children and their spouses. Unlike the ceremonies that had claimed the women of the family, Edmund's transformation was a celebration rather than a sacrifice. Walked to the cellar of his own accord, knelt before the wall of symbols, and spoke the words that would release him from his mortal form. The process was swift and apparently painless. Edmund's body simply faded away, becoming one with the stone and wood of the house itself. With Edmund's transformation complete, Cornelius assumed leadership of the family, guided by the voices of all those who had gone before him. The pattern was established, and it would continue for generations to come. Each head of the family would guide the bloodline for 20 to 30 years, before taking their place among the eternal guardians. But the Ashford family's supernatural power was about to be tested in ways that none of them could have imagined. The return of the witnesses, the year 1895, marked the beginning of what family records would later call the Great Reckoning. It started with the arrival of a stranger at the manor's gates, a woman who claimed to be a descendant of the original Whitmore family, the owners who had vanished so mysteriously nearly 70 years earlier. Her name was Victoria Whitmore, And she carried with her documents that challenged everything the Ashfords believed about their supernatural inheritance. According to Victoria's research, the manor had not been abandoned by the Whitmores. They had been murdered, their bodies hidden within the walls of the house, their spirits trapped and enslaved by an ancient evil that had dwelt beneath the foundation for centuries. You are not the guardians of some noble supernatural legacy, Victoria told Cornelius during their first meeting. You are the latest victims of a parasitic entity that feeds on human souls. Every generation of your family has been consumed by this thing, their essence absorbed to feed its growing power. What you call transformation is actually spiritual. Cannibalism. Cornelius initially dismissed Victoria's claims as the ravings of a madwoman, but her knowledge of the house's history was remarkably detailed and accurate. She knew about the hidden chamber, the symbols in the cellar, and the fate of every family that had lived within the manor's walls. More disturbing still, she knew about the children. The entity requires a constant supply of souls to maintain its existence. Victoria explained. Each generation, it manipulates the family into believing that they are special, chosen, destined for greatness. In reality, they are being groomed for harvest. The children born within these walls are not blessed with supernatural abilities. They are infected with the entity's influence, prepared from birth to eventually become its food. Victoria's accusations were supported by physical evidence that she had discovered during her research. Ancient records from the local church spoke of a hungry darkness that had plagued the area for centuries, drawing families to the manor and consuming them one by one. The symbols in the cellar were not protective wards, as the Ashfords believed, but feeding instructions, a recipe for the spiritual consumption of human souls. Most damning of all, Victoria had found the remains of the original Whitmore family, hidden within the walls of the manor itself. The bodies were mummified, preserved by the same supernatural forces that the Ashfords believed were protecting them. But the expressions on the faces of the dead told a different story. They were frozen in eternal screams of terror and agony. Your ancestors were not transformed into benevolent guardians, Victoria revealed. They were consumed, their souls digested and metabolized by the entity that dwells beneath this house. What you hear as their voices are actually the death cries of the devoured, echoing through the years as the entity uses their memories to manipulate each new generation. The revelation shattered everything that Cornelius had believed about his family's legacy. If Victoria was correct, then the Ashfords were not the inheritors of supernatural power, but the victims of an elaborate deception that had been perpetrated across multiple generations. But the truth was about to become even more horrifying. The awakening as Victoria's accusations sank in, the manor itself began to react to her presence. The walls grew warm, the symbols in the cellar pulsed with an angry red light, and the sounds that had always been attributed to the eternal guardians became more violent and demanding. The entity that had been feeding on the Ashford family for decades was not pleased to have its deception exposed. It began to manifest more directly, abandoning its subtle manipulation in favor of outright attack. Windows shattered without cause, furniture moved of its own accord, and the temperature in the house fluctuated wildly from freezing cold to sweltering heat. The voices that had once whispered gentle guidance now screamed obscenities and threats, demanding that Victoria be silenced before she could spread her poisonous truths. But Victoria had come prepared. Her research had revealed not only the entity's methods, but also its weaknesses. The thing that dwelt beneath the matter was ancient and powerful, but it was also bound by certain rules and limitations that could be exploited. It cannot leave the house, she explained to Cornelius as the supernatural attacks intensified around them. It is bound to the foundation, tethered to the stone and mortar that contain its essence. And it cannot consume souls that are freely given. It requires willing sacrifice, souls that have been deceived into believing that their destruction is actually transformation. Asterisk, the entity's rage at Victoria's revelations was palpable. The house shook with the force of its fury, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. But its anger also confirmed the truth of Victoria's accusations. If the Ashfords had truly been willing participants in a noble supernatural legacy, why would the entity react so violently to having its methods exposed? Cornelius began to understand the magnitude of the deception that had been perpetrated on his family. Every generation had been manipulated, controlled, and ultimately consumed by a force that cared nothing for their welfare or their legacy. The supernatural abilities that the children displayed were not gifts but infections, markers of the entity's growing influence over their souls. Asterisk, we have to stop it. Asterisk, he told Victoria, as the manor groaned and shuddered around them. Asterisk, whatever this thing is, however long it has been feeding on my family, it has to be stopped. But how do we fight something that has been growing in power for centuries? Victoria's answer was both simple and terrifying. We give it what it wants. We offer it the ultimate sacrifice, not the willing surrender of deceived souls, but the knowing sacrifice of those who understand the true cost. We feed it the truth, and the truth will destroy it. Asterisk, the plan that Victoria proposed was dangerous beyond measure. She and Cornelius would need to descend into the cellar, confront the entity directly, and offer themselves as conscious, willing sacrifices. But instead of allowing their souls to be consumed, they would use their knowledge of the entity's true nature to poison it from within. Asterisk, the thing feeds on deception and ignorance. Asterisk, Victoria explained. Asterisk, it grows fat on the souls of those who believe they are being transformed into something greater. But if we offer it souls that are fully aware of its true nature, souls that know exactly what it is and what it does, then we can introduce a toxin into its system that will eventually destroy it. Asterisk, the plan was desperate and probably suicidal, but it was the only chance they had to break the cycle of deception and consumption that had claimed so many generations of their families. As the supernatural attacks reached a crescendo, Cornelius and Victoria made their way to the cellar, where the final confrontation with the entity would take place. The confrontation in the cellar had been transformed by the entity's rage. The walls pulsed with veins of red light, the floor was hot to the touch, and the air was thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. The symbols that had been carved into the stone over the centuries were now glowing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the room, where Cornelius's grandfather had died so many years ago, a pit had opened in the floor. The opening was perhaps 6 feet in diameter, and it seemed to descend into infinite darkness. From within the pit came sounds that no human throat could make, a mixture of screaming, laughing, and a wet, consuming noise that suggested the feeding of something vast and hungry. Asterisk, it's beautiful, isn't it? Asterisk, the voice came from behind them, and Cornelius turned to see his deceased father Edmund standing near the entrance to the cellar. But this was not the benevolent guardian spirit that had been guiding the family. This was something else entirely. Something that wore Edmund's face but radiated malevolence and hunger. Asterisk, all these years, you believed you were serving your family's legacy. Asterisk, the thing that looked like Edmund continued. Asterisk, but you are actually serving me. Every ritual, every sacrifice, every willing transformation, it all fed my growth, my power, my eternal hunger. And now, thanks to your meddling friend here, I have the opportunity to feed more directly. Asterisk, the creature that had been masquerading. As Edmund stepped closer, and Cornelius could see that its form was not solid, but composed of shadows and memories, fragments of all the souls that had been consumed over the centuries. Within its shifting darkness, He could see the faces of his ancestors, all of them trapped within the entity's essence, their mouths open in eternal screams. Asterisk. You cannot stop me. Asterisk, the entity continued, its voice now a chorus of the devoured. Dead. Asterisk, I have fed on your family for generations, and I will continue to feed for centuries to come. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, they will all serve me in the end, just as you will serve me now. Asterisk, but Victoria stood her ground, pulling from her bag a collection of items that she had gathered during her research: salt, iron, and most importantly, a piece of stone that had been taken from the original foundation of the house before the entity had claimed it as its own. You're wrong, she said, her voice steady despite the supernatural chaos swirling around them. Asterisk, you can only feed on willing souls, souls that have been deceived into believing that their consumption is transformation. But we know what you are, we know what you do, and we offer ourselves not as victims, but as weapons. Asterisk, the entity's rage was tremendous. The cellar shook with the force of its fury, and the pit in the floor began to expand, reaching toward them with tendrils of darkness that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could perceive. Asterisk, you understand nothing. It shrieked. Asterisk, I am eternal. I am hunger itself. I will consume you as I have consumed all the others, and your knowledge will die with you. Asterisk, but Victoria and Cornelius had anticipated this reaction. They moved simultaneously, Victoria throwing her collection of protective items into the pit while Cornelius began to recite the true history of the house, not the sanitized version that the entity had fed to generations of victims, but the actual story of consumption, deception, and spiritual cannibalism that had been perpetrated within these walls. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The entity's screams reached a pitch that shattered every piece of glass in the house, and the pit began to collapse in on itself, as if the very foundation of the entity's power was being undermined. Asterisk, no. The thing that looked like Edmund wailed. Asterisk, you cannot do this. The family belongs to me. The bloodline belongs to me. Asterisk, but it was too late. The truth, spoken freely and without fear, had poisoned the entity's ability to feed. The souls that it had consumed over the centuries began to break free from its grasp, their true voices finally able to be heard over the entity's deceptive whispers. Cornelius could see them, now not as the benevolent guardians that the entity had pretended they were, but as the victims they had always been. His father, his mother, his sister, his wife, all of them trapped within the entity's essence, all of them desperate to break free from their eternal torment. Help us, they pleaded. Asterisk, end this. Stop the feeding. Let us rest. Asterisk, the choice was clear. Cornelius and Victoria could save themselves, flee the house, and leave the entity to eventually recover and continue its predations. Or they could make the ultimate sacrifice, offering themselves as the final poison that would destroy the creature once and for all. They chose sacrifice. The price of truth hand in hand, Cornelius Ashford and Victoria Whitmore stepped forward into the collapsing pit, their souls blazing with the truth of what they had discovered. The entity reached out to consume them, but instead of the usual feast of deceived souls, it found itself trying to digest pure, poisonous knowledge. The effect was catastrophic. The entity's essence began to unravel, its power to deceive and manipulate crumbling in the face of absolute truth. The souls that it had consumed over the centuries were finally released. Their eternal torment ended as they faded into whatever peace awaited the dead. The house itself began to collapse, its supernatural foundations undermined by the entity's destruction. The walls cracked, the floors sagged, and the very stones that had witnessed so much horror began to crumble into dust. But in the final moments before the manor's destruction, something unexpected happened. The released souls of the Ashford family, free at last from the entity's influence, gathered around the pit where Cornelius and Victoria had made their sacrifice. With their combined spiritual energy, they managed to create a barrier that would contain the entity's death throes, preventing its destruction from spreading to the surrounding countryside. The explosion of supernatural energy that followed was visible for miles around, a pillar of light that shot into the night sky before collapsing back into the earth. When the light faded, Ashford Manor was gone, leaving only a smoking crater where the house had stood for more than a century. The entity was dead, its hold over the Ashford bloodline finally broken. But the cost had been enormous. An entire family line had been consumed. Generations of victims had suffered and died, and the truth had come at the price of everything the Ashfords had believed about their legacy. The survivors' the destruction of Ashford Manor did not mark the end of the family's story. Hidden records, discovered years later, revealed that several Ashford descendants had survived the entity's predations by leaving the manor before their transformations could be completed. These survivors, scattered across England and beyond, carried with them the bloodline that had been so coveted by the entity. But they also carried the knowledge of what had really happened to their family, the truth about the supernatural legacy that had claimed so many of their ancestors. Some of these survivors dedicated their lives to hunting down similar entities, using their inherited sensitivity to the supernatural to protect other families from the same fate that had befallen the Ashfords. Others retreated from the world entirely, living quiet lives in remote places where they could not be found by forces that might seek to exploit their bloodline. But a few of the survivors were drawn back to Yorkshire, to the crater where Ashford Manor had once stood. They reported that the site was not entirely dead. On certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind was still, they could hear voices calling from beneath the earth. The voices were not those of the entity, which had been destroyed beyond any possibility of resurrection. Instead, they were the voices of the victims, the generations of souls who had been consumed, and were now trying to warn the living about the dangers that still lurked in the shadows of the world. Asterisk, do not trust. The whispers, asterisk, the voices pleaded, asterisk, do not believe the promises of transformation. Question everything. Seek the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. And remember, we are not guardians. We are warnings. Asterisk the legacy today, more than a century after the destruction of Ashford Manor. The crater where the house once stood remains barren. Nothing grows there. No animals venture near it, and local residents avoid the area entirely. The site has been fenced off and marked with warning signs, though the official explanation for the restrictions has nothing to do with supernatural dangers. But researchers who have studied the Ashford family's history have found disturbing parallels in other locations around the world. Ancient houses with similar patterns of family disappearances, mysterious transformations, and supernatural inheritance. Remote estates where bloodlines have been consumed by entities that feed on human souls while pretending to offer power and immortality. The Ashford case has become a cautionary tale for those who study the supernatural, a reminder that not all otherworldly phenomena are benevolent, and that the promise of transformation can often be a mask for consumption and destruction. Margaret Ashford, the young woman who had pressed her ear against the study door on that fateful night, was one of the few family members to escape the entity's influence. She had fled the manor just hours before its destruction, driven by an instinct that she could not explain but dared not ignore. Years later, she would write the definitive account of her family's supernatural legacy, documenting the truth about the entity that had consumed so many generations of Ashfords. Her book, published under an assumed name, became a resource for those who sought to understand and combat similar supernatural threats. But Margaret's final words in that book serve as a warning to all who would seek power from beyond the grave. Asterisk. We thought we were special. We thought we were chosen. We thought we were guardians of ancient wisdom and supernatural power. But we were none of these things. We were food. We were prey. We were the willing victims of a predator that had learned to dress its appetite in the clothes of destiny and tradition. Asterisk, asterisk. If you encounter something that promises to transform you, to make you more than human, to grant you power over life and death, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because the only transformation that such entities offer is the transformation from living soul to consumed essence, from human being to spiritual food. Asterisk, asterisk. The dead do not guard the living. The dead do not guide the living. The dead are dead, and anything that claims otherwise is lying. Trust in the truth, even when it is terrible. Trust in the light, even when it is harsh. And never, ever trust in the whispers that promise you immortality. Asterisk, asterisk. The price of such promises is always the same: your soul, your freedom, and your truth. And once you have paid that price, there is no going back. There is no transformation. There is only consumption. Asterisk, asterisk. Remember the Ashfords. Remember what we became. And do not follow in our footsteps. Asterisk. The crater where Ashford Manor once stood remains empty to this day, a scar on the Yorkshire landscape that serves as a reminder of the price of supernatural ambition. But late at night, when the moon is dark and the wind carries the scent of old roses and decay, local residents still report hearing voices calling from beneath the earth, the voices of the consumed, warning the living about the dangers that still lurk in the shadows of the world, telling their story, sharing their truth, and hoping that someone, somewhere, will listen. Asterisk, what do you think happened to the other Ashford descendants? Do you believe that similar entities are still out there, feeding on unsuspecting families? Have you ever encountered something that promised transformation, but delivered only consumption? Asterisk, share your theories in the comments below. And remember, if something seems too good to be true, especially when it comes to promises of power and immortality, it probably is. Asterisk, asterisk. Until next time, stay safe. And stay skeptical. Asterisk, asterisk. This is the end of another tale from the shadows. But the shadows are deep, and there are always more stories waiting to be told. Asterisk.